Hello, everybody, and welcome back to You Exchange, the podcast where I exchange my user experiences to change them, and yours for the better. I'm Jeremy, a mentor and senior user researcher with over 8 years of experience and a background in neuroscience. Throughout my career, I've had the privilege of engaging with hundreds of users around the world, spanning across Europe, the USA, Africa, and India. This has allowed me to deliver actionable insights that have improved user experiences with nutrition, automotive, delivery, and e-commerce sectors. I've created this podcast with the aim of providing my mentorship and educational content, offering actionable tips, knowledge, and guidance in the realm of research, specifically focusing on UX research to anyone having an interest in this area. And I hope that you will find this episode insightful. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the show. I know it's been quite a long time, and I'm sorry for that. I thank you in advance for those who will be staying until the end of the episode and for your patience. I have been busy with some personal stuff. Now everything is set up, and I'm happy to be back for this 3-episode series on how to conduct user interviews with best practices, with tips and techniques for effective user research. Before I start, I want to emphasize that this episode and this 3-episode series is directly taken from a masterclass that I gave recently on the topic. And so this masterclass was open to, quite a number of participants, but not everyone who might be interested in the topic could attend. So that's why I thought naturally that I would share this content with you so that you can access it even if you were not part of the masterclass. So let's start by what you can expect in this 3-episode series. So in the whole series, you can expect to learn the role and importance of user interviews, the different types of interviews, how to develop effective interview scripts, how to execute interviews with professionalism and empathy, and how, finally, to avoid common mistakes. So let's start with interviews in the realm of user research. But not only, to be honest, you will see that a lot of things that I'm about to say can apply to different fields. Even if you're not a user researcher, these sometimes best practices are almost what can seem common sense. You will see when you interview someone, when you want to learn more about something, some topic, and you are discussing with someone about it, these are good practices that can be useful to you even if you're not considering user research. So, in order for you to understand interviews in depth, I wanted to first cover the notion of user experience, then user experience research, and user interviews, so that you could have the global picture of how user interviews fit the whole user experience and user experience research process. So, what is user experience at the core? User experience, the official definition is a person's perceptions and responses resulting from the use or anticipated use of a product, system, or service. So let me tell you why I'm so interested in user experience, and this will be the topic of a subsequent episode. It has been quite a long time that I wanted to cover it. And so user experience is literally everywhere around us. It has, maybe not in those terms, but always been present, and it will always be. Because it has to do with our experiences as humans when we interact with a product, a system, a service. And I would go I would go further than that, and we would need to change the term. Instead of user experience, we should call it human experience, because not everything is linked to a product. So more often than not, it's a product that is a good that you acquired, and that's why we call it a product, and that's why we call it user experience. But in my opinion, it might not need to be all the time. So imagine you can be a user experiencing your, I don't know, note-taking practice. It's not a product, you didn't buy it, you didn't purchase it, but still you are experiencing it. You're experiencing a note-taking practice that is maybe your own. And so that's why I wouldn't always call it user experience, but sometimes human experience. And that's why I'm so interested by the topic, because it's present everywhere. Never mind, this is not the goal and the topic of this episode, but I just wanted to cover the basics and cover again the definition. Then, inside the user experience, which is everything linked to how humans or users perceive or anticipate the perception of their use of a product, service, and system, we have two things, in my opinion. Well, we have more, but we can subdivide this user experience into two main things when it comes to the conception of experiences. We have the design of it, so the idea of conceptualizing a product to answer users' problems, and we have the other side of things, which is researching about the users and understanding them at the core before making something. And so, as you may have gleaned from the different episodes that I've made, I am passionate with the understanding part, and so that's why I'm not necessarily, although I am to some extent, but I'm not necessarily particularly passionate with one area of product. I have some interests in some products than others, more in some products than others, but I am more interested in understanding humans, and more specifically understanding or use of products and technology. And so that's why I am more attracted to user experience research. And so that's the second part. User experience research is about investigating users to understand better their behaviors, their needs, and this will help us to inform the design and development of product and services. Inside user experience research, so user experience research, as you may have understood, is a collection of practices, methodologies, techniques, and behaviors, let's say, set of techniques, and science in the end, in order for us to understand the users. And inside of that set of tools and techniques and practices, we have user interviews. And user interviews, let's define it. It's no less than a methodology which goal is to collect data about participants, but in a certain way. We can collect data about participants and users and humans in several ways, okay? I can measure how frequently you connect through my app. I can measure the amount of products you purchase in my e-commerce store. I can send you a survey to understand what is your most frequent behavior when you exercise, whatever. So there are many techniques to collect data from humans, users, and participants. User interviews is one of them, and it is characterized by the fact that it's attitudinal. We will define what it means, attitudinal, and that we want to collect through this technique thoughts, feelings, to generate knowledge about the users, their experience, their needs, and their pain points. So now let's move on to what user interviews are. How can we characterize them? As I was saying, user interviews are one methodology among others, which themselves are part of the whole collection of user experience research methodologies, right? And I was saying it's attitudinal. What does attitudinal mean? Well, I don't know if you're familiar with it, But user research methodologies can be described along several dimensions. That's why we say in general that we have a landscape of user research methodologies. We say we have a toolbox. We say we have a set of user research methodologies, and that depending on the problem, depending on our objective, we will use one or the other. Well, they can be characterized along several dimensions. First of all, we can imagine one first dimension, which is attitudinal versus behavioral. You remember I said some minutes ago that user interviews were an attitudinal method. What does that mean? Well, attitudinal means something we say. It's an attitude. It's something we share verbally about how we feel, about how we perceive something, how we evaluate something. It's an attitude. Okay, it's almost, I would say, probably it is, I'm not sure to be honest, but it's almost the scientific way of describing things. Okay, so this is the attitudinal side. And then we have the opposite of this axis, which is the behavioral side. Behavioral refers to behavior, as the name implies, right? And so we have a first axis, which is opposing attitudinal and behavioral. So that means on one extreme, we have methodologies which will allow us to measure users' attitudes, meaning what they say, versus their behaviors, what they do. So you can naturally imagine that during user interviews, how user interviews are conducted is by speaking with my users, is by talking. And so I ask questions and the person answers. Just as you can see when you have a journalist asking questions to a celebrity, for instance. This is how it works. These are interviews. And so the way we gather answers is by hearing what the person in front of us has to say. And this is why we say that interviews are attitudinal, because we hear what the other person has to say. They are absolutely not behavioral. I can ask someone, well, what is your process when you pack your belongings to go to work every morning? Tell me about this. Okay, they can tell me, they will surely do, and they will try to do their best in general. Well, they are incentivized to do so, right? So they will be able to do it to some extent, but they might not say everything. Sometimes because they don't want to, sometimes because they don't remember, and you can imagine all the other scenarios. And that is why we say we have attitudinal methods and behavioral methods. And you can imagine why the best way to learn about a behavior from someone is just to observe that behavior. You just sit or stand up, whatever you prefer, and you just observe. And for that, we have other methodologies such as ethnography, for instance, or what is called naturally observation. It's as simple as that, observation. So first axis to conceptualize a user research methodology is attitudinal versus behavioral, and interviews is an attitudinal methodology. Then we have a second axis, which is the qualitative and the quantitative side of things. Okay. Qualitative, as the name implies, is the quality. And the quality here does not refer to something of high value. It's not that. It's just the nature of something. What is behind what is happening, for instance. So I always say to people who do not understand why we run interviews to gather insights, that is exactly for that. I don't want numbers. I want words. I want someone who tells me. So it can be, something can be attitudinal, but still in numbers. If you do a survey, for instance, you will gather what people tell you, but through a very constrained and repeatable way, right? but it will be numbers. It will be something that will be super repeatable, and it will be constrained to the format of the question. Whereas for interviews, it's not scripted what they will answer you. Everyone answers something different. That's the richness of it. So if I talk to someone, let's say Jane, she will tell me something. If I talk to Joe, even if the question is the same, he will tell me something else. And that's why we say that from 8 participants onwards, we arrive at what we call a saturation level, because at some point, participants will answer more or less in a redundant way. Anyway, that's not the topic. The main thing here to have in mind is that interviews is a way for us to gather richness of data, a breadth of data, a breadth of knowledge. We use interview when we gather something. We want to gather something we don't have. We don't know. We don't know what we're gonna get. Basically, you could argue it's the same with surveys, but with surveys you have a strong hypothesis. It will be option 1, 2, or 3, and then you will validate. Is it 1, 2, or 3? No. With qualitative, I don't even know what the options are. I need to discover them, and that's why I'm doing user interviews. That's why I'm asking people. And that's why I'm hearing them talk. And that's why it's so complex to synthesize data, because it's so rich. It can be so deep, the insights. Okay? It's like if I sit with you tomorrow and I talk for 1 hour and I ask you questions for 1 hour, I will learn way more things than if I just send you a survey for 10 minutes and that you answer. I'm not saying surveys are not as good as interviews. They just answer a different topic, a different goal, and that's why we will have a different another episode on the topic. But the idea is that interviews are qualitative. And why do we say qualitative? It's because we hear people speak directly, and it's unfiltered, and it's direct. It's what they have in mind, and then they answer with their words. It's their, how can I say, their material directly, and that will directly shape your knowledge about a given area. Whereas with surveys, we call it quantitative because it's an indirect measure. We are just counting how many people how many people are saying the same thing to validate something else, to validate a hypothesis we might have. And so for that, we use a really repeatable way of asking questions, and that allows us to count. And that's why we say it's quantitative. But we also say it's indirect measure, because from what the participant answers, which is constrained to the format, we will interpret already, due to the format, what they think. So if I tell you on a scale of 1 to 9, how happy or unhappy are you? You will answer me, right? But if I had asked you, how do you feel? You would have told me, oh, I feel quite happy because blah, blah, blah. And so that's why I always say interviews, you use them when you don't know what you need to gather. You have an idea with your research objectives, but you don't know what you're going to get. It's the idea. So I talked for a consequent amount of time of this topic, but this is the main idea behind interviews and their value. They are attitudinal. They tell you, they allow you to know, to hear what people have to say, not what they are doing, and it is raw information coming from people's mouth, and so that it's direct. It's not filtered. It's not transformed. It's not interpreted from you. It's interpreted later, but it's not interpreted just on the basis of the answer, on the basis of the format of the question. And so, as you might have understood, they tell you what people say, and why something is happening, how to fix a problem, how to fix an issue, and so on and so forth. Okay? And so that's the main concept about interviews, and that's why they are so valuable, because you you can just sit with someone and talk to them for whatever amount of time and just asking questions. And sometimes you don't even need to ask so many questions. Sometimes they will tell you directly what they think. And so it's really an inexpensive method. Really inexpensive method. You don't have to prepare. You have to prepare it, yes, but less than a survey, for instance. And even if you do an okay interview script, you will gather rich data. But if you do an okay survey, you will gather poor data, really. So it's harder to get it wrong. I am always comparing both, but it's because people tend to, in general, do surveys every time, thinking that surveys are the only tool. Surveys are a great and awesome tool that answer a specific question, and in my opinion, they should be used less often than I see they are, basically. Because in some cases that I see people using surveys, interviews should be used instead, to be honest. So that's why I wanted to spend so long on the interview process. And then I wanted to cover when they are most oftentimes used. So to understand that, let's take into account the product development process, the product development lifecycle or process. So we have several frameworks that exist, of course. We have the double diamond, we have the several stages that we go through, the cycles, and so on and so forth. I am not a fan of picking one framework and sticking to it. I am a believer in understanding what information these frameworks share and have in common to take the best of both or of all worlds. So basically, when we run a product development lifecycle, and if we do it correctly, we should start with what we call generative research to understand if there is a market need, a market opportunity to develop a product first. And so this is something, this is a great moment to use user interviews, basically. Because this is the step where you don't even know what's happening. You don't even know what is the problem. You need to talk to people first. You need to talk to people to imagine, tomorrow I want to develop an app for fitness enthusiasts. Yeah, great. Okay, I have some assumptions. Okay, but what are their problems? No survey is going to tell me that. No usability test is going to tell me that. I can develop my app and I can put thousands of dollars into a prototype, an app, or even developing the app or hiring an engineer or whatever. But if I don't talk to users and I see what they need, this will be a big failure. This can be a big failure. So that's why the product development lifecycle always starts with what I like to call empathize. So it's like discovery, generative research. And that's the good moment to use interviews. Then from these interviews, we will synthesize them into several artifacts. So think user journey, personas, empathy maps, and the like. Okay, we have a lot of tools at our disposal, and it will highly depend on what we on what we need. Then, and here you can think about the double diamond. Of course, we will diverge once again. So from the problem we identified by speaking to users, we will come up with ideas on solutions to solve the problem. And this is a stage that is called ideate. Then we will prototype, so we will conceive some prototypes and products to answer, to, let's say, materialize these ideas. And we will end up testing them. Testing them with users by asking them to go through, let's say, the use of the product. So it can be an app, but not necessarily. It can also be a physical product. It can be an experience. It can be anything. So we ask them to test the product. And then we will gather their feedback to see how we can improve their experience. And here, I want to emphasize once again that interviews could be valuable because if you have a prototype, even if you're more advanced in the product development lifecycle, you may not know everything. I guess I would say the main idea behind using interviews or not and in general user research methodologies. So to make things simple, I would say I would apply the 20-80 rule to user research. If you're not familiar with it, there is a principle that tells that 20% of your efforts in general will give you 80% of the results. So I would say like the minimum effort, if done right, will give you the maximum output. And then the remaining 80% of the effort will give you the remaining 20%. So it's your call to say if it's necessary or not to put 80% more effort into something. So applied to here, I would say the main 3 methodologies that I would try to master if I were to enter user research again would be first, user interviews, second, usability testing, and third, surveys. If you know how to do these 3 methodologies, you are good to go, in my opinion. You could answer 80% of the world's problems and in terms of user research. Why am I saying that? It's because user interviews are great at the empathize stage, at the beginning, when we don't know what is the problem for the user. Then you can use surveys at the stage of ideation for you to prioritize your features or your app ideas or your problem, whatever. You can use surveys at these 2 points. And then you can use usability testing to test your prototype. But why am I saying all that? It's because ask yourself every time, and be honest, be truthful. Ask yourself every time before moving forward, do I have enough before moving forward? And when I say enough, especially in the case of interviews, ask yourself, do I know enough about my users? Like before confirming something, before using a survey to validate something at a big scale, or before doing a test usability wise only, like what is the time my participant took to run a task? Before all of that, ask yourself, do I know, for instance, what are the most, the biggest pain points of my fitness enthusiasts? When you develop your app, do I know if users want to log in 3 steps or in 2 steps? Do I know if users expect XYZ feature in my app? Do I know what do they expect of a fitness app in general? Like if you ask yourself these questions every time, you pause and ponder, and you ask yourself, and deep inside of you, you don't. Well, that's the call you have to make to run interviews. Why am I saying all that? It's because when you reach the point of developing a prototype, even if you're at the stage of a prototype, it doesn't mean you don't have to speak to your users again. And in fact, I think it's highly valuable. If you have a prototype, let's say wireframe or a lo-fi prototype, you can still ask questions to your users to ask them, okay, how do you feel at the screen? What do you think of this feature? What would you do next and why? These kind of questions. And then, based on the answers, you refine again and again. I will repeat every time that it's best to run user research early and often, as early and often as possible. Then, of course, it depends on your capabilities and on your priorities inside of your team. Whether you're freelance or hired in a company, we cannot do every time user research. What I'm telling you here right now is the theory. Okay? In practice, it may not always be the case. Sometimes we have to go forward without user research because there is no means and because there is no money. It can happen. But if you have the opportunity, every time you have the opportunity, use that money and time wisely and invest it in user research. And that would be the stages where you can use user research, I would say. So at the stage of discovery, at the stage of testing your prototype to see if your users understand it, if it's easy to use, and why, do they find value in it, and why, what is frustrating them, and why, and so on and so forth. But of course, we could use interviews at way more stages, in my opinion. In my opinion, And they don't have to be big interviews. They don't have to be massive every time. They can be tiny. They can be about answering some quick topics, like for instance. And also, interviews don't have to be always with your users. You can do stakeholders interviews, for instance. So that's one thing. You can use them at the very beginning of your project. You can use them, imagine you discovered some things, but before rushing into a prototype, you think, oh, maybe I need to learn one more or two more things, and we have time and money. Yeah, okay, let's do a second round. Why not? Again, this is provided you have the time and the money. But at the very minimum, if I had to reduce, again, applying the 20-80 rule, the 20% of time you should use interviews that would provide you 80% of the results, for me, are at discovery stage, at the beginning of a product development process, and at usability first or second round of usability tests of your prototype. That's what I would do. And then if we should really loop the cycle, because it's true, I have forgotten about this. If we should loop the cycle, once you have an established product and you need to improve it, you will need to run interviews again, of course. Because let's say now I develop a product and I put it on the market, and then it's mature and it's like 6 months in, 1 year in, but I have competitors coming, and so I need to improve my product. But I don't know how I could do it. I have no idea. That's the thing. I have no idea. So even if I have a product already in place, I need to consider that I need to innovate again. And every time I need to innovate again, I need to run interviews. That's it. That's my take. Not everyone may agree with this, but in my opinion, it's better to run interviews when in doubt than not. So some examples that I had of when you can use interviews. So for instance, during discovery, you could use interview coupled with observation. And the idea also that I want to communicate is that interviews is not an all-in-one methodology. It doesn't answer everything, as I said at the very beginning of this episode. Interviews is characterized by two axes in the landscape of user research methodologies. You have the attitudinal axis versus behavioral, and you have the qualitative versus quantitative. And as such, it's qualitative and attitudinal. It cannot be used to answer quantitative questions, quantitative-related questions, and behavioral-related questions, for instance. It cannot be used for that. So naturally, if you have these kind of questions, interviews cannot be used. And so, as such, you need to complement interviews with something else. And so that's why, for instance, we can imagine during discovery, if you want to identify user problems, imagine my fitness enthusiasts at the gym, I want to identify their problems. I can ask them, I can sit on the bench press with them and tell them, okay, what do you feel when you do bench press? Yeah, great. But it's not enough. I need also to observe them. I need to observe, okay, probably the person needs to stretch before, and they forgot to mention that. Probably they need to drink. Probably they need to record themselves while they are in the gym to see if the movement is done right. And this is true story. I saw that recently. There is an explosion of that behavior, and probably they wouldn't mention it if asked, So that's an example. Then second stage, you can imagine when you define more about your product, but you haven't developed a prototype yet. So in this case, to inform about, let's say, your information architecture or your user journeys, we can imagine an interview coupled with card sorting or with tree testing to inform the information architecture. Or if you want to make sure you're in the right direction, you can couple interview with concept testing, for instance. Then at the develop stage, when you are informing the prototype design, as I was saying, you would run a moderated usability test. Meaning you will ask your user to, interact with the prototype, asking them following up questions, which are, in essence, an interview. And finally, when you deliver the product, meaning you have a finalized product with a set of features, you can also ask the user to interact with the product once it's finalized to have insights about the next step of iteration, because a product that doesn't iterate, that is never iterated on, will die. A product that is stagnant will die. And so that's why you constantly need to learn about your users, constantly. And so to learn about them, it's really interviews or qualitative methodologies. That's why I think they are so powerful. Then, to finalize on this episode, I just wanted to mention that, of course, as you may already know, there are different types of interviews. They go from the very structured extremity to the very flexible one. So we can imagine if I ask you, I don't know, what do you do when you pack your things to go to the gym? Okay, what do you do first? Okay, and then what do you do? And then, okay, yes. So as you can see, this is very structured. This is a predetermined set of questions that I will ask to all participants. It's good for consistency and comparability, and between groups, comparability between groups. It has a drawback of not being as flexible as the other types of interviews that I will cover now, and it's almost the same. Well, it goes in the direction, it's closer to a survey, let's say, to a questionnaire. And then we have the other extremity, which is the unstructured one. So it has really a minimal structure. It's a free-flowing discussion. We want to explore unexpected insights, and we use it when we do really, really early exploratory research, but really something really exploratory. Like, imagine you have no research whatsoever done before, or you have no assumption about the topic, so it's a bit, it's less frequent, let's say. The problem with that is that it can go in all directions. The good aspect is that it's really natural, and you can gather really deep insights, rich insights, not deep, but a breadth of insights. And so that's because the limitation, and again, I'm correcting myself again, it will not be deep because you will cover many, many topics and you will not go deep into each one. With the structured one, probably you go deep, but you don't cover many topics. That's also a drawback. And so that's why the semi-structured comes in between, let's say, because it's the best of both worlds, in my opinion. You can have in-depth exploration based on responses. You also have some predetermined questions, so you can be sure that you cover a set of topics, and each topic you can make sure you can go reasonably deep. And so for me, that's the most flexible. Well, not flexible, but the best of both worlds, let's say. And that's why it's the most commonly used. So here you have them. You have the structured, semi-structured, and unstructured interviews. And so, to sum it up, we saw that user interviews are an attitudinal research methodology that is part of several UX research methodologies, all contributing to understanding our users. We saw that user interviews are characterized by the fact that they are an attitudinal research method, qualitative because they allow you to to gather direct insights about your users, that they can be used at several stages of the product development life cycle, with the main ones, in my opinion, being at the discovery stage, at the testing stage, and when the product is launched stage, let's say. We also saw that user interviews are not an all-in-one methodology. They need oftentimes to be coupled with other methodologies such as observations or probably quantitative methodologies. For instance, something I didn't mention is that the usual next step after an interview is to validate your insights quantitatively to make sure they are that they are experienced by a high enough number of participants, let's say, if that makes sense. And finally, we saw that interviews can be characterized by their level of structure, how structured they are, and their level of flexibility. And so that's it for the episode of today. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned at least one thing. If it's the case, please subscribe to the podcast. Leave me a review. And if you know someone who could be interested, it would be really awesome if you could share this podcast. And again, if you want to leave a comment, suggestion, or if you want me to cover a specific topic in next episodes, leave me your note in the link that will appear in the show notes. Thank you again for assisting, for listening, and see you in the next episode. Bye-bye. And that's it for today's episode. Thank you everyone for joining me today on New Exchange. I hope you found today's episode insightful and valuable. Make sure to subscribe in order for you not to miss the next episode. Share it if you liked it, and leave a review. Thank you for your time and attention. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for future topics, feel free to reach out directly to me. You can find all the details in the show notes. And see you in the next episode. Bye-bye.